That evening, Guderian's bridgehead was 8 miles deep.
Oh, we're doing this again? Confetti saved up.
As the panzers raced westwards, they created an ever longer corridor just a few miles wide. The Allies realized that this was open to counterattack.
I don't like where this is going.
The bulk of the German army was still totally dependent on horsepower or its own feet for transport. So the gap between the rampaging panzers and the follow-up infantry grew with every hour.
Everybody moves fucking slow. Everybody moves really fucking slow. You don't know what you're doing here.
By now, the German High Command were becoming worried by their extended lines of communication. So, for the time being, driving south into the rest of France was put on hold until the infantry had caught up.
This video is sponsored by Raycon. They sent us their E25 earbuds, and I'm going to let Sarah take over because she has stolen them from me and loves them.
Hey guys! So, these have been a dream for me because I hoop dance, and when I do, I always prefer to use earbuds instead of a speaker, but always have to deal with a long cord while I'm dancing and it getting caught on stuff, having my phone in my pocket, and all kinds of things that I have to fumble with and watch out for. But with these, I don't have to deal with any of that. They're cordless and have a good range for the Bluetooth, so I can leave my phone somewhere else, and they fit so well in your ears with the several silicone tip sizes that they come with that I can jump and spin, and they never fall out. The everyday E25 model also has more bass than their previous models, and with the deep bass, no cords to fumble with, and the noise-canceling design, I can totally tune the world out for up to 6 hours before they need to charge. The case it comes in is small and sleek and easy to transport, and also doubles as a charger.
Raycon earbuds start at about half the price of any other premium wireless earbuds out there, and the E25s come in new colors. We really genuinely love these earbuds, and they are a steal for the price. To get 15% off your order, click the link in the description or go to buyraycon.com/potentialhistory. One of the strange and almost anomalous things about the Second World War that people have trouble reconciling with a lot of the rest of it is why Germany was able to do so well at the very beginning with all the factors that would eventually lead to problems and eventually its downfall, such as a small pool of manpower, being behind in the production game, and poor execution on the operational level. Given how long Germany limped ahead for most of the war, how were they able to pull off such feats as knocking out France in 6 weeks when they hadn't been able to in the last war after 4 years of trying? How were they able to sideline the British for a few years in continental Europe? And I'll be the first to say that you can't give a single answer to this question, but there are things that you can point to that begin to explain this phenomenon that stand out among the others as to why it happened. One thing often pointed to is technology. And although there are examples of things that the Germans got right before other nations, I think this is largely the result of backdating areas that they were ahead in later in the war that were not quite as present early on. One of them being the excellent division of labor in the Panzer III and IV that was not present in the major tanks of the other nations at this point. However, the rest of the world would catch up with this fairly quickly, and during these early successes, these vehicles wouldn't make up the whole force, with Germany only really phasing out their one-man turrets by 1942, although they still weren't fully gone by then. Another thing pointed to is the high level of training given to the 100,000-man Reichswehr in the period before the Versailles Treaty was utterly dropped and ignored.
Stieg ein Verlierer. Wir wurden kollektiv und selbst more durch Krieg begehen.
Due to the limitations in the number of men allowed in the German army after the First World War, only the best of the best got into the military. They were trained 2 levels above their current station so that the organization would be ready for expansion whenever the time came. This has some bearing on my eventual point, but the impact of 100,000 men on the eventual 7 million plus man army is going to be muted just by the sheer size of what it became.
So where do they find those cadres? They have to go back to the veterans of World War I. And the first sergeants and company commanders and battalion commanders in 1939-40, even going into Russia in 1941, they're all in their 40s.
So yes, this instilled a culture that would prove helpful, but in practical terms, its reach was limited. And the last one I hear, as funny as it sounds, is a kind of catch-all, the Germans were just better at this. And you see this sentiment a lot when people praise the Germans for their ingenuity and skill tactically throughout the war, being just so vastly superior and impressive that no other nation could touch them. And the German tactics were impressive. I'm about to get into one area of it that was very impressive. One pointed to is how they massed their motorized forces to punch through enemy lines and create mass encirclements that gave them a lot of success during this period. They weren't the only nation to mass motorized forces. Pretty much every nation had units that did this, even France, and they saw equal success when they were used correctly, but the Germans definitely used them correctly the most, and it's reflected in how successful they were. As time went on, though, their adversaries did figure out how to counter this, while the Germans were unable to evolve to the point of ramming their heads into the Soviet lines at Kursk. So yes, revolutionary, but once the game had changed and the enemy was defending and counterattacking differently, they had real trouble figuring out how to adapt, and it has foreseeable consequences. Which, when you pair that with their ignoring of the operational side of any campaign that lasted much longer than a couple of months, the myth of the untouchable Germans really falls apart, and you see that their mastery of warfare was a lot more narrow than you may think, given how people talk about them and praise them so highly. But one thing that I would point to, among a few, is essentially German commanders' ability to disobey orders. Auftrag's tactique was nothing new when World War II began. It had its origins in the 1800s and really began to be used in a modern sense in the First World War with the Sturmtruppen,
Stoßtruppen,
the first waves of attacks late in that war. These troops would go ahead of the main force, punch through enemy lines, and dive as deep as they could into them, clearing the way for the troops behind them in a sort of mobile warfare, as we would call it today, sort of tactic. Now, this was the early lineage for two things. One, the massing of mechanized forces that I cover in the German tank meme video, but two, the ability of commanders on the ground to act independently. Commanders of these units had to make judgment calls based on what they were seeing and often had to adapt plans and orders they were given based on what was going on in the moment to achieve their overall objective, even if that meant doing something other than what was initially planned. And German doctrine in the interwar era builds on this with a vengeance. The basic idea is that a commander on the ground will be given a loose set of orders to accomplish a mission. He would then be able to use whatever tools at his disposal in whatever way to accomplish that mission, and as long as at the end of the day he got that task completed, there wasn't much fuss about the way he went about it, unless it resulted in some kind of catastrophic failure. It also meant, just like our World War I commanders, that if a general in the field was given an order from on high, and he saw a better or more effective way to accomplish what that order wanted him to do, but not in the way it wanted him to do it, he could completely disobey that order, and as long as he was still successful, he would not be punished for ignoring the chain of command. Now, when you look at the early war German successes, some of the biggest turning point moves in them are as a result of this doctrine. The most famous being the breakthrough in France, where, to be fair, Rommel really exposed his flanks and was fairly rightfully told to stop long before he actually did, but continued forward, eventually reaching the coast, cutting off the majority of Allied troops in the north, leading to the famous events we all know about today. And you could really point to his refusal to stop and bold move to do that as one of, if not the, major point that brought the German victory. And that's the most famous example, but the entire French campaign is full of examples of the fluid German command system outmaneuvering the rather rigid top-down French one, to where by the time the French commanders had their orders approved, the German commanders who didn't have to do that had already run circles around them, to where the action they had just been cleared to do was no longer applicable. This system did have downsides, though. There were situations where German commanders made a gamble based on their ability to do this, and bet wrong, leading to defeats and reprimands, if not firings and demotions. This didn't mean the German commanders could just completely ignore orders and do whatever they wanted as well. If a commander decided to change what he was going to do from what he was told to do and he was unsuccessful, he would be in trouble for disobeying the orders. It was only if he succeeded that there would be no punishment and congratulations. And this whole system is the building block for a lot of things that we associate with the German army now, such as Kampfgruppen, which is entirely a commander in the field putting troops together to accomplish a task he was given and doing with them whatever he needs to accomplish that. Generally speaking, that is. You could go on and on about Kampfgruppen, but that's the basic idea, and it comes from this. As you could probably guess, though, Hitler was not the biggest fan of this system that he inherited from the interwar army before he took over, and as the war went on, he became more and more controlling, and deviations from what was ordered were not as well tolerated. And this is obviously one of the many reasons German effectiveness waned throughout the war. But it is interesting to note that as Hitler clamped down on his commanders and allowed them less and less freedom of movement, the Allied armies were doing the exact opposite, particularly in the Soviet Union, where Stalin began the war micromanaging and ended the war pretty much leaving his generals to do whatever they thought was best. being very hands-off. Now on the micro-tactical level, the Germans remained fairly good at adapting, and once they had waned in the attack after Operation Citadel falling apart very quickly, they quickly became very good on the defense, holding back the inevitable for what I would say was longer than they really had any business doing, considering all the factors. But as time went on, it was more and more an occupational hazard to be this sort of renegade commander, changing how he operated based on the situation, as that was tolerated less and less as time went on, much to the detriment of the Army's ability to conduct operations as a whole. As I said, this is one of many factors, but one that very much stands out to me. I've linked a talk from which this video is based on down in the description below, and I'm curious what you think was the key to early war German success and why it fell apart so abruptly within a year or so of its height. Thank you to Raycon for sponsoring this video and making some of the recent economic changes a little less scary, and thank you to all my patrons for doing the same on a consistent monthly basis. I'll see you all at game night. Wow. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in, like, I don't know, a month or so. I'm a complete joke.